For over 1,000 years, the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt were a complete mystery. Then the discovery of this stone in 1798 started an extraordinary intellectual race. Jean-François Champollion in France and Thomas Young in Britain both believed that the Rosetta Stone, as it was called, held the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. But the Rosetta Stone did not yield its secrets easily. For 2 decades, it would tantalize and frustrate two of the most brilliant men of their time. I've come to Egypt with Dr. Bill Manley, an authority on hieroglyphs, to find out how scholars got to grips with this long-forgotten script. We've come to the tomb of Ramesses VI in the Valley of the Kings. So the sarcophagus gets brought down here.
Yep, this is a ramp for sliding the sarcophagus all the way to the burial chamber.
Early Christians had forbidden the use of hieroglyphs, believing them to be pagan and sinful. As the centuries passed, all understanding was lost. Some scholars argued that hieroglyphs were a phonetic script, just like our alphabet. Others believed it was nothing more than primitive picture writing.
Now we're in the actual burial chamber of Ramesses VI, and we're surrounded by really mysterious scenes of the king's rebirth. And these are surrounded on all sides by hieroglyphic text. Now, after the 5th century AD, people couldn't read these texts anymore. So they looked at the scenes and saw that the scenes were mysterious and obscure. And so they assumed that the hieroglyphic script was mysterious and obscure in itself.
So the pictures convey vague ideas of enemies and capture and rebirth and so on.
Yeah, the scenes look mysterious, but the hieroglyphic texts are actually there to make clear what they're about.
European interest in deciphering hieroglyphs took off when Napoleon arrived in Egypt in 1798. His primary motive was military, but he took with him a team of scientists, surveyors and draftsmen who catalogued everything they encountered. This was a scientific mission to gain the knowledge and wisdom of the ancient pharaohs. Within a year, they made an extraordinary discovery. Whilst enlarging a fort in the small port of Rosetta, French engineers discovered a stone bearing a unique inscription, one that would rapidly intensify the race to decipher the hieroglyphs. But their triumph was short-lived. The stone was confiscated by the British after Napoleon's defeat in Egypt, brought back to London and eventually erected in the British Museum. And this is it, the single most famous slab of rock in archaeology. And what makes it so remarkable is that it has the same piece of text repeated 3 times in 3 different scripts. So at the top, we have the mysterious hieroglyphs. In the middle, we have Demotic, which is a sort of shorthand version of hieroglyphs. And at the bottom, down here, we have the Greek. And of course, scholars knew how to read Greek. Therefore, they knew what the Greek said. Therefore, they knew what the hieroglyphics said. And therefore, they hoped they'd be able to decipher the meaning of individual hieroglyphic symbols. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as simple as that. First of all, there was the problem of how to match Greek phrases to the appropriate hieroglyphs. Scholars simply had no idea which Greek words corresponded to which symbols. Secondly, most modern scripts are alphabetic. Symbols represent sounds. But the hieroglyphs bore no resemblance to any known alphabet. For a start, most alphabets in the world typically have about 30 letters, whereas there are over 700 hieroglyphic symbols. The alternative to an alphabetic script is a pictographic script, in which symbols represent not sounds, but ideas. So the hawk hieroglyph would represent the idea of a hawk, or the idea of flying or speed. But this didn't make sense either. Many hieroglyphs on the Rosetta Stone are pictures of birds, but the Greek text, which states it is a translation of the Egyptian, never mentions birds or anything remotely connected to flying. In fact, it's largely about taxes. Far from being the key to hieroglyphs, the Rosetta Stone seemed to make matters even more confusing. It took a genius to make the first breakthrough. In 1797, a medical student arrived at Emmanuel College, Cambridge.
Thomas Young was an extraordinary polymath. He tried to explain what causes the tides. He studied acoustics. He studied what things do when they bend and stretch. He even invented a machine for measuring tiny distances, such as the width of a hair. He was fascinated by the human eye, how it perceives the color of light, how it focuses light. He was even interested in the very nature of light itself.
Thomas Young is one of the most acute minds I think this country has ever produced. He's simply a genius. What motivates him is curiosity about almost anything in the real world. He's ever asking questions, writing out things in his textbooks, crossing them out and doing them again, in order to try and get to the root of the mystery. He was essentially a person who liked solving problems.
When it came to the problem of the Rosetta Stone, Young used an old codebreaker's trick. He looked for a so-called crib. A crib is some small piece of the hieroglyphic text that you already know the meaning of, and which you can then use to start deciphering other hieroglyphs.
Young noticed that within all the hieroglyphs, there are some that are surrounded by a loop, such as these hieroglyphs here. It's called a cartouche. Now, he assumed that these hieroglyphs must represent something important, perhaps the name of a king. Now, one king mentioned within the Greek is Ptolemy, so perhaps this cartouche reads Ptolemy. Now, this is really important because not only have we matched up a piece of Greek text with some hieroglyphs, we also know how these hieroglyphs are pronounced. Ptolemy is pronounced the same whether you're talking ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian.
The cartouche contains 8 hieroglyphs. So could it be a word made up of 8 letters from some mysterious alphabet?
Young's stroke of genius was to take the cartouche and to assign a sound value to each hieroglyph to spell out the name Ptolemy or Ptolemaish in Greek. So let's have a go. The square must be a P, the semicircle a T, the noose an O, the line an L, the hair clip an M, the double feathers an E, and the hook an S, so that we have Ptolemaish. Now, in hindsight, we know that Young did make 1 or 2 mistakes. But in general, he got the right sounds for the right hieroglyphs.
But Young himself could not be confident about the accuracy of his work. The next step should have been to cross-check his decipherment against other cartouches. But suddenly, he abandoned his research. He believed that the name Ptolemy was merely an exception. It was only spelt phonetically because it was a foreign name. He felt that for traditional Egyptian names, and for all other Egyptian words, the hieroglyphs behaved as pictograms. One symbol represented one word.
What Young had done was to show that some hieroglyphs, some of the time, were phonetic, were an alphabet. He was tempted to believe that this was simply something that happened very late on in the history of Egypt. After all, they needed to write funny Greek names like Ptolemy or Ptolemaios.
Young had made the first breakthrough, but he had guessed the meaning of just one tiny set of hieroglyphs. The rest of the stone, as well as the writings of an entire civilization, were still a complete mystery. Progress on deciphering the hieroglyphs was proving slow and difficult. Scholars had theories, and some even declared that they had cracked the code, but they were wrong. Young's work was sent to Paris for evaluation, and among the scholars who received the paper was the brilliant linguist Jean-François Champollion. Champollion was a child prodigy. He could read Homer and Virgil at the age of 9. At the age of 10, in 1800, just after the Rosetta Stone had been discovered, he met the secretary of Napoleon's mission to Egypt, Jean-Baptiste Fourier.
Fourier brought back dozens of wonderful relics that fascinated the young boy. However, Champollion was puzzled. What was the meaning of the strange symbols that adorned the pieces? Fourier explained that nobody could read these strange symbols. At that point, Champollion declared that one day he would decipher the hieroglyphs.
The young man had mastered 12 languages in order to mount his attack on hieroglyphs. Champollion was initially convinced that hieroglyphs were not an alphabetic script, and even released an article saying as much. When Young's work on the Ptolemy cartouche came to his notice, Champollion did an about-turn. He changed his mind, but without mentioning the influence of Young, and even tried to destroy all copies of his article. He decided to adopt the alphabetic approach, and, more importantly, he tried to extend it to other cartouches that had just been obtained from Egypt. He started with the most famous Egyptian queen.
So here we have a cartouche of Cleopatra, and just as we did with Ptolemy, we've associated a letter with each of the hieroglyphs. What Champollion then did was to cross-check between the two cartouches. So, for example, in Ptolemy, the P is represented by a square. In Cleopatra, the P is represented by a square. In Ptolemy, the O is represented by a noose. In Cleopatra, the O is represented by a noose.
This level of consistency showed that Cleopatra, like Ptolemy, was written phonetically. But Cleopatra was also a foreign name, so critics still argue that everything else was just picture writing. The debate was eventually settled, thanks to an inscription found at the temple at Abu Simbel. Champollion received a copy of reliefs from the temple in September 1822. The temple has 4 giant representations of a pharaoh who towers over the landscape, facing the rising sun at dawn. The pharaoh was obviously important, but nobody had any idea who he was. The secret lay in his cartouche, as yet undeciphered.
A copy of this cartouche ended up on Champollion's desk. Now, not surprisingly, he tried to decipher it, but he didn't have much luck. He knew that the N2 hieroglyphs represent the sound of the letter S.
The symbol appears in the name Ptolemaeus.
So we have a double S or C's, but he didn't know the meaning or the sound of the other 2 hieroglyphs. At this point, Champollion made a remarkable intuitive leap. He'd been studying Coptic, the language of the Coptic Christian Church, the Egyptian Christian Church.
He theorised that Coptic, being the oldest surviving spoken language in Egypt, would be related to the way that ancient Egyptians spoke. Other scholars had advanced the same idea, but none had the linguistic skill or knowledge of Egyptian culture to show how it could work in practice. He knew the first hieroglyph represents the sun god. In fact, at the top you can see the sun. The Coptic word for sun is Re. So now we have Re something sees. Re something sees. Well, Champollion wondered, perhaps this represents the name of the pharaonic king Ramesses or Ramesses, the great pharaonic name Ramesses. What's remarkable about this is that Ramesses is a traditional ancient Egyptian name. It's not modern or foreign like Ptolemy or Cleopatra. And if the Egyptians used hieroglyphs to spell out phonetically ancient Egyptian names, then why shouldn't they use hieroglyphs to spell out all Egyptian words? This is the moment that the code was cracked. So hieroglyphs do behave largely like the letters of an alphabet. For example, the letter M is represented by an owl. The chick represents the letter W. And the reason that there are so many hieroglyphs is because some represent combinations of letters, syllables. This hieroglyph, a plough, represents the combined letters M and R, mer. And this hieroglyph, a game board, represents the sounds M and N, mun. Sometimes it's more complicated. This famous hieroglyph looks like a sandal strap and means sandal, or unk in ancient Egyptian. But the word unk also means life, so the same hieroglyph can mean life. Or it can simply provide the sound unk as part of another word. All of this took time to deduce, but it was Champollion's linguistic skill and insight that unlocked the most difficult of all codes, a forgotten script, whose key had been hidden for centuries. He was so overcome that he rushed into his brother's room and shouted, "I've got it," and fainted. Champollion's breakthrough unleashed a whole new world of insights into Egypt's past. Bill Manley was keen to show me an intriguing example at Aswan. Among all the hieroglyphic texts, is there anything that's the equivalent of Samuel Pepys's diary?
Not diaries as such. People don't record their innermost thoughts, but you get letters that they write to other members of their family. You get notes to the milkman, if you like. The plan of this place is the same as a typical Egyptian temple, but it's not a temple for a god. It's a shrine for a human being. You can see what the real job of hieroglyphs is, and that's to explain clearly what goes on in places like this. Before Champollion's work, there was no real inkling of what's being talked about here, which is ancestor worship. Family members would gather at the tombs of their ancestors and eat a meal in the chapel that we're at now. They would talk about the maintenance of the integrity of their family. Even though a central member of their family has been taken away, the family stays together. Ancestor worship wasn't mentioned by classical authors, and therefore, until we could read texts like this, was an important aspect of Egyptian culture of which we knew nothing. The two basic rules of reading hieroglyphs are that, first of all, you always read from the top downwards, and secondly, any sign that has a face and looks in a particular direction will always look towards the beginning of the text. We can see that the hieroglyphic text begins here and reads this way. The first hieroglyphs together, we get the word imach, which means a revered one. The second word here, the first hieroglyph is a ball of string, which gives us the sound ch. The mouth gives us a sound R. So we have khair, which means before or in front of. The third word is spelled out with two hieroglyphs. This jug here spells out the sound chenem, and that's the sounds in the name of the god Chnum. Chnum in Egyptian art was represented as a ram, It doesn't contribute anything to the sound of the word. It's what we call the determinative, and these are written at the end of words to give you some indication of the nature of the word.
So that tiny jug or vase represents a syllable. That syllable happens to be the name of the god, but just to reinforce that, you draw a picture of that god. So the determinatives help us, but in general, the rest of the hieroglyphs are phonetic.
That's right. It emphasises the fact that we're dealing with the ram-headed god Khnum. The revered one before the god Khnum, the lord of the cool water region, which drops down here. The chief of Elephantine, which is the name of the town nearby here. The governor, which is a title that this man held. And then finally the name of this man, Nebkau-Ra-Nacht.
In July 1828, Champollion made his first and only trip to Egypt. At last, Champollion could read the hieroglyphs at first hand, deciphering inscriptions that had previously been impenetrable, reading new insights into Egypt's past. For example, here at Karnak, scholars had previously known nothing about the temple's history, but Champollion, by deciphering the hieroglyphs, could tell that it had taken over 1,000 years to build the temple complex. When Champollion saw the monuments for himself, he had to struggle to stop himself from weeping. The effect was overwhelming. He wrote, "We Europeans are like people from Lilliput. No people, ancient or modern, have ever conceived of architecture on such a scale, so large, so grandiose, so sublime. The Egyptians," he wrote, "thought like people who are 100 feet tall."
F is snake here.
On returning to France, he wrote up his notes about the trip.
Mary, which means his beloved.
As soon as he had finished, he suffered a massive heart attack and died.
Ankh, the word for life.
He was only 41 years old.
Body, Necha, Nether.
It was as though his work was done. He'd cracked the code.
And the series continues next Thursday at 9. For more information...
On a beach in the East Mediterranean, not far from Haifa, lie the colossal ruins of a once great city. 3,000 years ago, the city of Dor boasted massive stone-built battlements and a finely equipped harbor. It was a citadel of the Sea Peoples, a name the ancient Egyptians gave to several groups, including the Phoenicians, who were eventually crushed by the Israelites under King David. For 12 seasons, an international team has excavated the massive ruins here. On August the 13th, 1992, University of California archaeologist Andrew Stewart was just about to wind up another season at the dig. One more day of hurried recording and cleanup was left. And then the unexpected happened.
And Ranbir, the square supervisor, came over to me after about half an hour and said, Andy, it was about that rubble that you asked us to dig. And I said, yeah. I said, we got rid of it yet? He said, actually, we got rid of most of it, but there's a foot sticking out of it, and it's human.
For the next 11 hours, the team raced to uncover the skeleton pinned under the rubble. As the bones emerged, so did the clues. The pelvis was broad, and so could only have belonged to a woman. The excavators judged that she was in her 30s. Her body was contorted, and her arms were raised up as if to protect herself. But the effort had been in vain. Ephraim Stern, who has worked at Dor for 21 years, believes the woman was a casualty of King David's attack on the city around 1000 BC.
The Phoenician city had been captured by the Israelites during the beginning of the 10th century by the armies of David. So she was killed when the city had been captured by the army, by the soldiers, and her body, like the body of many other people, have been left where she was killed and exactly where we found her.
But Stern's collaborator, Andrew Stewart, disagrees. He thinks the woman was killed by a collapsing stone wall.
Nothing that we found as we were digging her suggested to us that human violence was in any way involved. There was no knife sticking into her body or anything like that. But more importantly, everything that we found was consistent with almost a split-second accident. It didn't seem to us at all that she had been, say, murdered, then somebody pushed a wall over on her. It looked to me as though it was a single event which contorted and crushed her.
Stewart's view was tested when the bones were examined at the Hebrew University Medical School. Anthropologist Patricia Smith found no cut marks such as might have been inflicted by a knife or a sword. The bones were smashed into many fragments.
The question was, could I find any evidence on the skeleton to determine how this individual died? Well, as you can see, most of the bones are fragmented, but if we look here especially, we can see here and here this spiral fracture that I was talking about, and if you look very carefully, you can see that there's a raised edge here. This is the sort of fracture that only occurs in fresh bone. This particular break definitely occurred either when she was still alive or immediately after she died.
Buried among the ruins of her pantry for 3,000 years, the crushed and twisted remains of a young woman seem to confirm the biblical account of David's conquest of the Phoenicians. Or perhaps they tell of a greater conflict, the shifting of massive plates beneath the Earth's crust.
I think what happened, judging by the rocks that we found on her, was that the wall began to fall for whatever reason. She turned around to flee, and it caught her as she was turning around. And a rock seems to have hit her in the pelvis, another in the rib cage, and a third on the head. And when she turned, her foot twisted and broke.
As she fell to the floor, broken potsherds and animal bones sliced into her body. The impact of the stones broke her neck and shattered her skull. But what caused the stones to fall? The earthquake possibility has been pursued by earth scientist Amos Nur. He thinks there's good evidence that at least 9 other sites in northern Israel suffered severe damage around 1000 BC, the date of Dor's destruction. His quest for clues about ancient earthquakes took on a dramatic new meaning one day in October 1989.
For many years I studied earthquakes as a theoretical thing, like many scientists do. Until the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California. I was in my office at Stanford University, and my office completely collapsed during the earthquake. I dove under my desk just a split second before my huge steel bookcase came down. It was that experience in 1989 that transformed me from an earthquake theoretician to a practitioner. And I decided I really want to understand this, the human aspect of past earthquakes, not just the theory.
The 1989 quake killed 67 people. 1 year earlier, a quake in Armenia killed as many as 25,000 people. Though we understand earthquakes better than in Old Testament times, they are still as lethal. Geologists tell us that some places are predisposed to earthquakes, and their occurrence is as inevitable as it is unpredictable. This was the scene in Jerusalem in 1927, when an earthquake only slightly weaker than those in California and Armenia struck. The threat lies in the 2 great fault systems that cut across the Holy Land. One runs north-south. Along it lie the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan, and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea itself was created when two giant pieces of the Earth's crust split and spread apart along what is known as the Asia-Africa Rift. At 400 meters below sea level, it is the lowest point on the Earth's surface. A smaller fault follows the mountains known as the Mount Carmel Ridge and runs into the Mediterranean just north of Dor. Earthquakes occur as the plates on each side of the fault periodically slip, tear, and grind against each other, producing some of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. Earth scientists seek to find a pattern in these violent events. To learn what clues an earthquake leaves behind, Nur studied the Hellenistic and Roman ruins at Beit Shan. A well-documented quake struck here in 749 AD, leaving a dramatic tableau of devastation.
For earthquakes and archaeology, Beit Shan is truly unique because we know that an earthquake happened here and we see its effects. For example, here we see a cracked column that collapsed here. Here is another stone layer, and altogether they were the facade of this temple, which must have risen to about 50 feet right above the street. And during the earthquake, all the structure fell into this main street of Beit Shan, as you see it right here. We see many other things more subtle. Buckled street. We see, for example, a staircase here that got completely distorted and tilted by this earthquake. We see here the separation between the blocks and the stairs, and here, and the slippage between these blocks due to this earthquake here. The importance of this evidence is that it gives us a calibration for effects in places where we don't know that an earthquake has happened.
But proving that earthquakes happened isn't always easy. These are the ruins of Megiddo, a city that lies at a crucial gap in the Mount Carmel Ridge. For thousands of years, traders and armies have sought this pass through the mountains. It has witnessed dozens of bloody battles, including the crushing defeat of the Turks by British forces under General Allenby in 1918. But long ago, Megiddo apparently suffered another kind of destruction, and its name, translated by the Greeks into Armageddon, became synonymous with the ultimate cataclysm. Its apocalyptic end is familiar to us from the book of Revelation. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake such as was not seen since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake, and so great. Was Armageddon inspired by a real event? Though the ancient city of Megiddo was located at a strategically vital pass through the mountains, its position was vulnerable. Megiddo's inhabitants, who left layer after layer of refuse here beginning 8,000 years ago, may have learned to live with disaster. Famed Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin dug here in 1960 and found many bones crushed under mud brick walls. The date of the disaster was about the same as the one at Dor, 1000 BC. Yadin blamed the damage on King David's attack on the site, even though the Bible does not list Megiddo among his conquests. Nur thinks his own explanation is more plausible. Because Megiddo sits right on top of the Mount Carmel fault and is only 30 miles from the bigger Dead Sea fault, he believes a giant earthquake struck Megiddo and inspired the biblical prophecy of Armageddon.
The reason I think that Armageddon is associated with earthquakes, besides the fact that it's sitting on an active fault, in fact, we know there are earthquakes here. We know there were earthquakes here, so this place was shaken many times. And if you look at the construction, or like the wall behind me, this is very poor anti-seismic construction. In the book of Revelation, the description is of a huge battle, which will be accompanied by an enormous earthquake, such a one that has never happened. The earthquake will crack the city into 3 parts, It will make the mountains disappear. It will make the ocean recede. The movement of the ocean is a tsunami. We know it from any earthquake. The cracking of the city into parts is just the typical collapse of these cities. Somehow they have an extremely precise description of an earthquake to happen in the future.
Yet another site in northern Israel has yielded signs of earthquakes. The great mound of Hatzor lies a few miles from the Sea of Galilee. More than 3,000 years ago, it was an important cult center of the Canaanites. Later, under the reign of King Solomon, the city became a key strategic center for the Israelites. Amnon ben Tor has dug here for the last 4 years.
Most of what you can see today on the Acropolis of Hatzor, where we are, dates to the Israelite period. It starts with the 10th century, not the city, but the monument that I'm referring to, the gate just behind us and the city wall, attributed to the 10th century to King Solomon. It is mentioned in the Book of Kings that Solomon built Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, 3 large sites in the country, and most probably this is indeed of the days of King Solomon. Well, we can tell by the pottery that it is of the 10th century. So this is one important monument.
Yigal Yadin also dug at Hatzor in the 1960s. Though he seems to have ignored the possibility of earthquake damage at Megiddo, the idea suddenly took hold of him at Hatzor. The crucial evidence came from Stratum 6.
Stratum 6, according to Yadin, was destroyed sometime towards the middle of the 8th century by an earthquake referred to in the biblical narrative, the famous earthquake in the time of Amos. And the archaeological evidence for that, according to Yadin, is that many of the walls which he found are tilted, and this, according to Yadin, cannot be explained by any human destruction, any human causes. Only nature could create such a destruction, hence earthquake.
Yadin linked the tilted walls he'd uncovered to an earthquake mentioned in 2 Old Testament books, Amos and Zechariah. Most biblical scholars put the date at around 760 BC.
In Hatzor, for example, we have a beautiful case of destruction by an earthquake. It's beautiful because in the site itself, there is tremendous evidence for collapse of a building and broken parts and so on. And we also have a biblical description of the same earthquake. It happens during Uzziah's time in about 750 BCE, and presumably devastated the entire country.
It is perhaps too easy to attribute a city's destruction to an earthquake. Over the millennia, buildings fall, ground shifts, battles are fought. Hatzor's tilted walls could have any number of explanations.
Indeed, there are many walls which are tilted at Hatzor. There may be other causes, the topography, the slope. I don't know if anyone would ever be able to be positive about the cause of destruction here. So for the time being, it's a nice story, it's a nice interpretation, it's a nice possibility, but to say that we are 100% certain, I don't think we can.
The terror of earthquakes is synonymous with destruction and death. But in one of the most familiar yet curious of all Old Testament stories, an earthquake may be considered a miracle. The saga of Joshua recounts how his soldiers blew on their trumpets and caused the walls of Jericho to come tumbling down. One thing is certain. A great walled city did stand here, at an important crossroads just north of the Dead Sea. Excavations in the 1930s and 1950s revealed Jericho to be one of the oldest cities in the world. Around 6000 BC, they fortified Jericho with tremendously strong walls. On the west side was a round stone tower no less than 23 feet high. The Jericho that Joshua's army may have confronted belongs to a later era, around 1400 BC. Here, archaeologists have also found evidence of huge defensive walls and the victims of a violent disaster.
The skeletons that were found in Jericho were crushed. They weren't just buried or put in the ground. They were crushed with broken limbs, and one of them had a huge stones right on top of it. To us, it implies that some big collapse was involved in killing these two people. Aside from skeletons, jars with grain were found in Jericho and other foodstuff that was also covered by rubble. And it probably means that it wasn't an attack of an army, it was some kind of catastrophe that buried these foodstuff, and that's where they stayed.
Noah thinks an earthquake can explain another puzzling element in the Joshua story.
During the 1927 earthquake, or because of it, the Jordan River stopped flowing because of slumps into the river from the banks of the river. The same thing happened many times before, as we know from historical records. And the remarkable thing is in the description of Joshua's conquest of Jericho, there's also a description how the Jordan River went dry and the Israelites crossed it while it wasn't flowing. The stories and the events are so similar to what we have seen in 1927 and other earthquakes, it makes it a very compelling case that an earthquake was involved in the collapse of the walls of Jericho and the conquest of the city by Joshua and his army.
Archaeologists such as Amnon Ben-Tor are cautious about taking the Bible too literally.
Because a lot of what you read in the Bible is in itself in interpretation of somebody who interpreted events that happened before his time. So the question is, what do you take as evidence? Okay, this is the question. Once we agreed on this, definitely the Bible should be used, must be used to illustrate, to corroborate, to fill in gaps. The same thing goes also for archaeology. Archaeology can give meaning, can fill in gaps in our understanding and so on. So it goes both ways. Archaeology and the Bible have to be linked.
As far as Noah is concerned, his quest for the truth behind stories such as Joshua and Sodom and Gomorrah is more than mere academic curiosity.
What we hope to get out of the study of historical earthquakes and the archaeological evidence is to get an idea about the time-space pattern of large or moderate earthquakes. And in order to do that, we have to go to places where we have very long historical record. This is the best place to do so. Hopefully in the future we're going to get some idea of whether there is a precise repeat time or some other pattern in earthquake which could help us tremendously in figuring out how to predict earthquakes in the future. We want to use the past to predict the future, if possible.
By tracking the incidence of earthquakes in the Middle East, Noah hopes to arrive at a means for predicting future quakes. His study of ancient catastrophe may alert us to the role of earthquakes in the Holy Land and help prepare us for the inevitable shocks to come.
In every age, the threat of earthquakes has aroused a special, chilling fear. Modern science helps us to understand the forces deep within the earth that give rise to these terrifying events, even if the goal of prediction remains elusive. But how much more frightening it must have been then for the people of Dor or Megiddo or Jericho when their world suddenly collapsed around them. Little wonder such catastrophes were attributed to the vengeance of God and passed into the realm of biblical legend.
We've come to the tomb of Ramesses VI in the Valley of the Kings. So the sarcophagus gets brought down here.
Yep, this is a ramp for sliding the sarcophagus all the way to the burial chamber.
Early Christians had forbidden the use of hieroglyphs, believing them to be pagan and sinful. As the centuries passed, all understanding was lost. Some scholars argued that hieroglyphs were a phonetic script, just like our alphabet. Others believed it was nothing more than primitive picture writing.
Now we're in the actual burial chamber of Ramesses VI, and we're surrounded by really mysterious scenes of the king's rebirth. And these are surrounded on all sides by hieroglyphic text. Now, after the 5th century AD, people couldn't read these texts anymore, so they looked at the scenes and saw that the scenes were mysterious and obscure, and so they assumed that the hieroglyphic script was mysterious and obscure in itself.
For over 1,000 years, the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt were a complete mystery. Then the discovery of this stone in 1798 started an extraordinary intellectual race. Jean-François Champollion in France and Thomas Young in Britain both believed that the Rosetta Stone, as it was called, held the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. But the Rosetta Stone did not yield its secrets easily. For 2 decades it would tantalize and frustrate two of the most brilliant men of their time. I've come to Egypt with Dr. Bill Manley, an authority on hieroglyphs, to find out how scholars got to grips with this long-forgotten script. But their triumph was short-lived. The stone was confiscated by the British after Napoleon's defeat in Egypt, brought back to London and eventually erected in the British Museum. And this is it, the single most famous slab of rock in archaeology. And what makes it so remarkable is that it has the same piece of text repeated 3 times in 3 different scripts. So at the top, we have the mysterious hieroglyphs. In the middle, we have Demotic, which is a sort of shorthand version of hieroglyphs. And at the bottom, down here, we have the Greek. And of course, scholars knew how to read Greek. Therefore, they knew what the Greek said. Therefore, they knew what the hieroglyphics said. And therefore, they hoped they'd be able to decipher the meaning of individual hieroglyphic symbols. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as simple as that. First of all, there was the problem of how to match Greek phrases to the appropriate hieroglyphs. Scholars simply had no idea which Greek words corresponded to which symbols. Secondly, most modern scripts are alphabetic. Symbols represent sounds. But the hieroglyphs bore no resemblance to any known alphabet. For a start, most alphabets in the world typically have about 30 letters, whereas there are over 700 hieroglyphic symbols. The alternative to an alphabetic script is a pictographic script, in which symbols represent not sounds, but ideas. So the hawk hieroglyph would represent the idea of a hawk, or the idea of flying or speed. But this didn't make sense either. Many hieroglyphs on the Rosetta Stone are pictures. So the pictures convey vague ideas of enemies and capture and rebirth and so on.
Yeah, the scenes look mysterious, but the hieroglyphic texts are actually there to make clear what they're about.
European interest in deciphering hieroglyphs took off when Napoleon arrived in Egypt in 1798. His primary motive was military, but he took with him a team of scientists, surveyors and draftsmen who catalogued everything they encountered. This was a scientific mission to gain the knowledge and wisdom of the ancient pharaohs. Within a year, they made an extraordinary discovery. Whilst enlarging a fort in the small port of Rosetta, French engineers discovered a stone bearing a unique inscription, one that would rapidly intensify the race to decipher the hieroglyphs.